Hello, everybody out there in Facebook land. Chioma, Joy, and Zach back here in the new year to talk about serving our families and students and children with special needs. I know it's the 11th of January, but Happy New Year if you can still say that. Hello. Uh, what we're going to be talking about today is this idea of intersectionality, the idea of what happens when different parts of our identities intersect, particularly in terms of special education. We are taking this idea of intersectionality from the work of Ms. Kimberly Crenshaw, who has done amazing work. She has a very powerful TED Talk, which hopefully we can get shared out there. I dropped it in the chat about what intersectionality is. So I strongly encourage that video. Very, very, very Cliff Note style. If you think about all of us, we are not just all one identity marker. We are many identity markers. For instance, I am not just white. I am a male. I am an able person. I am relative middle-aged. I am privileged to have a comfortable amount of wealth. All of that. I am Jewish. Like all of these are markers of my identity. What intersectionality is what happens when those identity markers intersect. Kimberly Crenshaw's work started with a legal case wherein a woman sued on rights as an African American woman, but up to that point there was no law on the books to protect African American women. There were laws to protect African Americans and laws to protect women, but there was no law to protect the intersectionality of a African American woman. And that's the importance of this idea of intersectionality, because if we ignore intersectionality, if we ignore the realities of what it is to be a special needs person who is also white, a special needs person who is also poor, a special needs person who is also black, who is also Spanish speaking, if we ignore those intersectionalities, we ignore people. And we ignore actual situations, and people fall through the cracks and are denied services that all their rights. So that is the background of why this stuff's important. I'm going to pass it off to Joy. I'm going to come back to an idea later on, but I want to pass the idea to Joy. So taking that very kind of 20,000 foot level idea of intersectionality, how do you come at this idea?
So hey everybody, Happy New Year. Dealing with intersectionality growing up, fortunately I was prepared to deal with it. My mom told me I had three things against me. I was black, I was a woman, and I have a hearing disability. So I always knew that those three things were going to be a part of who I am. It is, right? And so dealing with that, it gave me I knew I was going to be hit on all three sides or all together at once. And so, dealing with that, it taught me how to look at the world, how the world will see me. But also, these three things, I like to call them my superpowers, because it's a way for me to speak up for all three things at once: being for black people, for women, and for people with disabilities. So dealing with that, I had to use this in school, academics. I didn't have to so much deal with it in the workplace, but growing up and going to school, I had teachers that would try to tell me, because I was black and disabled, they said go to the junior college route, and I'm like, no, I'm capable. I can do college prep classes. I can apply straight to a university. And just to again, this was part of my advocacy work and learning how to advocate for myself, is knowing that I'm able. I know what I'm capable of doing and succeeding. But now showing other people who don't know how to uh, work with someone like me, or just showing them, changing their perspective of how to deal with someone who have intersectionality. So, dealing with this is still prevalent in um, it's still prevalent in all the work that I do, even in the workforce. So just but growing up is just one of the things where it's you have, as a parent, my mom, she knew what I was capable of doing and everything, and telling me you're worthy of any opportunity that you come across.
Thank you, thank you. And Chioma, when we think about outside of our own experiences, if we think about families who are navigating this process, what are some of the things we need to be aware of, or things they should be aware of?
Yeah, I think that an intersectional lens really clears up, or for me, it's a clarifier. It's a clarifier of where we're being othered and how, right? Like, I think it's not just the addition of race, class plus gender. I'm Black, I'm woman, I'm disabled, I'm poor, you know, I'm queer, I'm gay, I'm immigrant. It's a question of what it means to also survive and navigate this world with those co-occurring conditions, right? Like, and I think for a lot of families, there are some universal truths, right? There's universal truths in life, right? That's why we can say Black people. We know that Black men and Black women fit under the umbrella of Black people because there's a shared experience. Excuse me.
You're good.
Yeah, I think I swallowed my own. Give me a second. But in any case, I think that it's an important understanding in preparing families to go in and directly advocate for their kids. It gives you a sense of who am I? It's a strategic advantage if you're able to analyze or interpret the existing laws based on what is in education. For example, if a family can come into an IEP meeting and they're discriminated against and they may not understand it, they may feel hurt by, feeling silenced because they may be a single mom or a single parent, or they're not educated enough, or they're made to feel dumb because they're new to the community and they're new to school and they're not used to the culture of the environment. Those things can be true and you emotionally take it away. But if you don't have the understanding of your identity that may be playing in to potential discriminatory behaviors towards you, that earmarked in the IDEA, earmarked in the Civil Rights Act, earmarked in, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is now ESSA, Every Student Succeed. If we don't know, if you're a homeless family and you're being ostracized and you're not actually being helped, these are the basis of legal complaints. So I think there is a social application to intersectionality based on our social emotional ability to process bias, implicit or explicit, when somebody's discriminating against you. But the teeth of an intersectional lens legally, that it was the basis of Kimberly Crenshaw, who's grounded in critical race theory, is that this is a platform in which one can advocate for better policy, better legislation, or better execution or interpretation of the existing laws, like the existing IDEA and all these other laws that I said. So families can take action. You may not be able to change the hearts and minds of people in one sitting or in one incident, but there's steps that empower you so that you're not a victim of every time your identity becomes a barrier to your access and success in life. So
So when I think about intersectionality in this way with special needs, two kind of things come to mind, and I'd love both of your thoughts on it. One is the reported over diagnosing of Black and brown, predominantly boys, with special education diagnoses for a reason, for biasy, racist reasons. On the same time, there's also the impact of an under-recognizing. It sounds contradictory, but it's kind of not. On the one hand, you have an over-diagnosing, but on the other hand, you have an underappreciation of actual diagnosis. So at one time, in one way, you might say like those kids are that special ed, right? And disparate amounts of young black boys and young brown boys are labeled as special education. And at the same time, there is a tendency to not support students, Black and brown students with special needs because of racism and biases within them. So I was wondering if you could speak to these seemingly contradictory but kind of not ideas.
I'll go ahead. So, like you said, in some ways, say, for example, perfect example for me is, when I went to two different deaf, hard of hearing mainstream programs, and one was in Oakland. The students in Oakland were majority students of color. They received lack of services. This is how, the IEP, my mom was one of the more vocal ones fighting for my services. And then when we moved to Berkeley, because it was mostly I was the only Black student, and my classmates, their parents were professional doctors, lawyers. They could advocate for their children. That's when I got services. I got way more, I got speech therapy regularly. I got all kinds of service accommodation, basically. And just to see the two where the racism, and it's still kind of in some ways still happening in today in Oakland and Berkeley's program. It's just to see how that bias of, oh, well, the parents aren't aware of their rights to speak up and fight for their children. They Black and brown parents they're just told, take what the professionals say at hand, but don't challenge them. And so it's kind of like ingrained in us in a sense where you're if you're not educated enough to know, you're not going to challenge the system. And so that racism, that barrier, that's going to hinder those children even further, to the point where even after they graduate from high school, they like, who cares about me? I've been told I'm not worth anything, So that that carries on through some of these children's lives, even after high school, even, if they're not aware to speak up and advocate for themselves.
Yeah, and I'll add to that in saying that I think that even the framing of the question of over diagnosing or under identification, those are the two extremes, right? That's the polar that we see, and they seem to target the same population, right? So I think from an intersectional lens, I think we have to look at the fact that all disability categories are not equal, right? So while we may see an over identification in emotional disturbance, ED, or specific learning disabilities, SLD, with their 14 eligible disability categories for the IDEA, we're seeing that Black kids are under-identified for autism, right? Because autism and autism care, and somehow, for whatever reason, it's seen as something that excuses behavior, potentially explains, opens the door for more accommodations, that white kids get identified earlier or properly in age than Black kids, particularly a lot of Black boys who could be understood as autistic, because they're, you know, and a lot of assessments are subjective in any case, especially around these neurodevelopmental conditions. So even the assessment tools, I think, have to be revamped to be culturally responsive to the population in which they are attempting to evaluate, assess, and diagnose ultimately. But that we're seeing these two problems based on this similar situation. Poor kids, get pushed out. A rich kid with an IEP may be able to get all their accommodations in a general education in the least restrictive environment, right? A rich kid can get outside tutoring, can get can advocate, pay for a lawyer to come and make sure you get a dedicated aide and that the kids' goals are being met. And then the IEP is actually a tool of empowerment. Where a poor kid, a poor family, or immigrant family, or a Black family, there are already cultural stigma around being identified as you're already othered in the world. So there's the community and cultural pressure to not identify with a disability because it's going to be stigmatizing. And then on top of that, say you did come to terms with the need for extra support, what are the chances you'll actually get it based on your station in life, right? We know that disproportionately Black boys with disabilities get suspended at higher rates than any other population of students in the entire school buildings. Black girls of any ability are getting suspended at higher rates than non-Black girls, right? Than white girls or Latino girls. And so we're seeing this abundance, like intersectionality, I think it's critical theory, right? So critical theory says that we're not just going to take any one idea and we're going to look at it like we can put everything in a cookie cutter box. It actually debunks that myth. So sometimes I can hear that argument that there are an over-identification of Black kids. And in my mind, I go, it's an ableist attempt to disrupt a conversation around ability and the difference in ability. You can take that same conversation and apply it to a legal framework where a child who was wrongly diagnosed and the school did so consciously in order to push the kid out of classroom because they didn't want to deal with their behaviors in the general education setting, which is also illegal because we want to go for the least restrictive environment. What tools you have to fight, and based on what understanding you have. That is the power that intersectionality can have for our population and our families.
So it seems that the idea of overdiagnosis is wrongly named. It seems that what we're speaking about here is racially biased misdiagnosis. And what we're more seeing, or if I'm hearing you correctly, what I'm hearing is let's say a white boy, for instance, demonstrating X behaviors is going to fit into this bucket, whereas a boy of color displaying the same behaviors may be thrown into a different bucket that is less likely to receive services or less likely to be thought of in a positive light. It's more of a deprecatory light, more of a negative light. Am I hearing you correctly in that way, Chioma?
Yeah, I mean, I thought of a quote. There's a Black radical thinker called Nellie Fuller, and he says something that I think is quoted and I think is accurate in this moment, that if you don't understand white supremacy, that any phenomenon that happens in the world is going to confuse you, right? Like, the issue for me is not over or under identification. It's the fact that our kids are being treated within a white supremacist or white-centered, a white ableist, survival of the fittest framework that says that your ability makes you superior to the next person. So it's an unsafe space to discover truths. It's an unsafe space to create interventions to get to your next best level per what that means for you. The problem, the beauty and the power of the IDEA is that it's an individualized education program, right? Like, the bias comes not just in one way. The bias comes in both angles or multiple angles, right? So that same case of saying that a child may be racially biased and being misdiagnosed or not properly identified can also, that same argument from an intersectional lens can be made for a kid who was not properly identified, because what you're looking at is a system that objectifies the Black experience, the poor experience, the immigrant experience, right? Like, these things are not known. So the system can never properly, accurately, scientifically give you the right things to do about whatever it is you're trying to understand about what you're supposed to do. So we have to recreate every step of it: the curriculum, the assessment tool, the location, the environment. All these things are contributing factors to where injustice breeds for marginalized people. And from a racial lens, a racial equity kind of perspective, it's only going to happen, in my understanding, when we're looking at disability related issues. It cannot happen till we address ableism, right? We don't address ableism. So you could say many things about misdiagnosing in order to silence what it is to actually have a disability. It all depends on who's making the argument and why they're making it and to what end.
So we got a question in the comments section, and I'm going to kind of divvy this question up a little bit. So the question was, how do you learn to self-advocate? How can teachers, parents, and students learn to become self-advocates? So I'm going to kind of parcel out this question based upon our expertise. So I'm thinking about, I might talk about how teachers can learn to be self-supporting. Joy, it sounds like you've been self-advocating forever. So I'm going to have you talk about that. And Chioma, I want you to think about how do families learn to be self-advocates for themselves. So I'm going to give you all think time, right? This is the teacher's toolbox, right? So I'm going to give you all some think time while I talk about teachers. So for teachers, how do we become advocates for our students? The first thing we need to do is read the IEP. That's the first thing you can do as a support for your students, is to read the IEP for a couple of reasons. One, it requires time and your focus, and there are a few things that are more righteous, more demonstrating of your advocacy than giving your time and your focus. So if you sit down with the IEP, understand that. Now, that being said, right, I've also had to teach 130 students a day, right? And 30% of them may have had IEPs. That's a lot. And the IEPs might be that thick, right? So that is a lot of reading. I strongly encourage teachers, administrators, etc., to build in a practice of what's called students at a glance, SAGs. And what these are they are 1 to 2 page glimpses of, here's a student, here is their diagnosis, here is their accommodations, here are some of the ways the teachers have worked in the past, here are their goals. Short, simple, to the point. It gives you a cursory glance. It does not replace reading the IEP, but it is definitely better than nothing and gets you to learn things. Just a real quick example. There was a student I taught who had significant trauma in his background and could not be touched. I am the kind of teacher who kind of goes around and cuts desks and fist bumps, all that stuff. So if I had not read that SAG, if I had not read that student at a glance, I would have made a horrible mistake. And I would have probably touched that student in the way that would have been perceived as a threat. And what would have been so disastrous about that is that the student would have gotten in trouble, not me, right? So I think that is the first place to start. So Amy Early, who put this question out there, I think the first thing teachers need to do is start really basic, is read the IEP, get the students at a glance. And if you don't understand what you're reading, it is incumbent upon you to learn about it. You may not have gone to education school to be a special educator, but guess what? You are a special educator because there are students in your room who have special needs. So whether you know it or not, you're a special educator. So you got to learn up, right? You got to study up and learn. When we think about students advocating for themselves, Joy, what should we be thinking about?
Student advocating for themselves, same thing. Your IEP, you know who you are. Fortunately, my disability isn't an intellectual disability. Uh, about the time I was in middle school, which is what I will tell everybody, if your child is able, start having them participate in IEP meetings. By middle school, the child knows where they kind of want to go academically, post academic, post secondary. So attending my IEP meeting and listening to the feedback from the teacher and my mom, and then saying, well, I want to do this. I would, they gave me a turn at the table to say, give some input. So knowing my ability as well and knowing what we're all agreeing on. Remember, the IEP is a legal document. So knowing what we can all agree on, I know what services I'm supposed to have. I can say it verbatim. If my interpreter, I used to have sign language interpreters in class, if my interpreter didn't show up, I knew who to get in touch with, the special ed resource or administrator for special ed. Hi, why did my interpreter show up? Where was my substitute? Just knowing how to just ask the right question, but at the same time, here we go with intersectionality as a black woman, young black lady. I couldn't come off as being defiant as well. I had to speak in a way with authority, but at the same time, not in a way where I'm not talking back to a teacher. It's just a way of showing I am aware of what I'm supposed to have and what you're supposed to do for me. So you know, students kind of start advocating for themselves. I would say about middle school and high school when you start having them participate in IEP meetings. And again, I kept my IEP meetings way until after I graduated because it's a nice way to see how far I've come and how far what I've accomplished and what more I may need to work on. But it's kind of like my little Bible in a sense. I know who I am. I know what I need to. I know what I'm supposed to have. I know who to ask for. It's kind of like those things. Who I am, what services I'm supposed to have, who is the contact person, if my accommodations aren't met. Of course, because I'm a minor, talking to my parent about it, having my mom. My mom, this is before emails, my mom would call the teacher and leave a message. So now with emails, we have written documentation. So that's what it's about for students and people with disabilities to start self-advocating.
I remember another episode we did where we spoke about the idea of having the students sit in on their IEP meetings, you say around middle school age, and how that totally tripped me out. And I think it is so brilliant because it's, as we've said, it's theirs, right? It's their education, it's their IEP. They need to be there. I think that's so profound and something that I know we haven't done with our boy yet. He's in second grade, so we haven't done it yet. But I think that's such a powerful way to do it. Thank you for that, Joy. Really thinking about that. You got me in my feelings as a dad. So Chioma, if we're thinking about families, how can a family go about building that advocacy muscle, particularly through an intersectionality lens?
Sure. So I think this is again my opinion. This is not legal advice. I'm not an attorney. I cannot give legal advice. My general advice and my experience has taught me in working as an advocate that it is important that the sooner a family comes to terms with the fact that this is war, sometimes it's Cold War, sometimes it's guerrilla warfare, sometimes it's a drone. You're tactically facing different challenges because you are entering spaces that are going to trigger you no matter what, right? So I think the first part of being a self-advocate is being aware of your environment, right? Am I safe? Is my child safe? Are we together safe? And I wouldn't be simplistic about unpacking that question, because there are people that can smile in your face and tell you everything's going to be okay, and they're doing you the worst disservice. This is the same question around the identification. There are enough people that will tell you to wait. Oh, your child, nothing's wrong with that child. That child just being naughty. That child just being bad. That child just needs a good whooping or whatever, right? People will say those things. Those are biased statements. People will say, oh, that's because mom is this way or dad is this way, and that's why the child is this way, right? So the more that one can be very, as much as possible, be in the business of intelligence gathering and assessing and calculating to execute a strategy. The parent who comes out disempowered is the parent that doesn't have a plan. If you don't have a plan, you're not going to get anything that you need for your child and your family to achieve a quality life at the end of your journey. You will become a victim of what is the most powerful platform any parent has in the entire public education system in the United States of America. There truly is no more powerful space. No other law grants parents the kind of authority that the IDEA gives. What makes you an advocate? A self-advocate, a family advocate is the person that understands what is going on. The first, most important, concretely, the first thing you want to study is not even just the IEP. Read the policies and procedures, the procedural safeguards. Those are a combination of the federal law and the local laws in your state, in your district, that govern what you are supposed to understand is your responsibility, the responsibility of the school, and what happens when there's a failure on a part, particularly the schools, who will turn their problem to your problem. They will blame you for systemic failures. And the whole thing with intersectional identities, and why I think from the question framing it and answering it with intersectionality at heart, is that you already know that you have a few things behind you. And again, it takes self-awareness. It takes sober self-awareness, right? To say, listen, I'm a single mom, but I'm a powerhouse single mom, right? So you're not about to treat me like like some garbage that somebody that's not represented. There's one of me, but it could just be as good as 10, because what I know is good enough for 10 people. If I already know that I am behind on terms of, if I know what may be facing me in this room, it doesn't help for me to act as if the challenges that are facing me aren't actually facing me. The question is, how do I make it not my deficit? How do I make sure that, or if it is a true deficit, how do I make sure that I am accommodated? Mind you, I think in the IEP space, or in the disability space, in the special education space, race is not your primary contradiction. Your primary contradiction is your ability, right? So I think part of intersectionality is like, what it's a calculation. What calculation matters most? So I can have a relationship with any parent, white, black, Latino, Asian, because we are united on a foundational oppression, which is ability. But we differ. I'm not going to come in there like I'm Zach.
Yeah.
In an IP meeting, right? I'm going to come in there like I am myself, and that I have a strategy, a game plan to win the war. The other thing, I think it may be harder for white parents sometimes than Black parents, because we're already kind of suspicious of the system. I think I sometimes have to talk my white friends and white clients up. This is war. They don't fundamentally get that until they realize their kid is getting screwed.
Right. And for those of us unused to roadblocks, unused to systemic obstacles, it can be hard to imagine those things exist. But they definitely do. They definitely do. One thing that's on my mind. It's a particular. Well, I'll come back to this in a second. I wanted to ask another question first for Joy and Chioma. Where do I start? If let's theoretically, let's say I got my child's diagnosis yesterday. How do I start? What book do I buy? What group do I join? What Facebook do I, or where do I go? Who do I email? Like if I'm underwater, right? Like I'm drowning. I just got this diagnosis. I don't know what to do. What's my first Google search? What's my first Facebook group? What's my first book?
Yeah, I'll take this first. I think, again, depending on your station, like if you are a parent with resources and you have the financial wherewithal, I would get an advocate, and not just necessarily to show up for me, but to explain the path, explain the way. And you would get that quicker if you have the resources to get that. With the one-on-one with somebody who's skilled, who is more likely not an attorney, so they're going to bill you at a lower rate, and give you the lowdown and help you come up with a strategy and help give reason to your experience. A resource that's available that is mandated by the law, I think I've brought this up in a series before, is that in fact, every state has a parent training and information center. That unfortunately is not the best funded system. One of the things that I hope happens under the new administration is increased funding under the IDEA, to fully fund the IDEA or get it up to greater capacity, which includes funding these parent training and information centers to be able to do more work than they're able to do with the chump change that they're given, to be able to do like really important work, which is parent training, which is, understanding your child's diagnosis. I would say the first thing you want to do is study your child's disability. I mean, you want to study the law, you want to study the rules, you don't want to lose. It is a game, it is a war. But for your benefit, for your family's benefit, for making you the expert that you are, you want to study anything that will empower you to understand better your child's trajectory. You just got this diagnosis. You just discovered your child has dyslexia. What does that mean for your child, for other children, for families? There's a Facebook group for every disability category. Look it up, right? There's a Google search for everything. Look up IEP accommodations, look healthcare access. And again, this is a privileged stance, knowing that I have internet access. I can read, I'm literate. I'm highly educated to interpret technical information, right? We're not all on the same page of what our first step is going to be. If you are in the most disadvantaged situation, you want to reach out to your PTI because they can help and guide you to other systems that may be able to give you, if you're a parent with a kid with a new diagnosis or a suspected diagnosis and you're homeless and you're housing insecure and you're undocumented and you're in a domestic violence situation and you got a parent in prison, you're going to approach this question slightly differently than if you're sitting it, that is your only deficit in life. So I hope that's helpful. And
it's very helpful. Joy, where would you start?
Again, from like Chioma said, fortunately, with I like to call the internet the library on our phone, basically. I would start with internet, some Facebook group, but then at the same time, with research, different organizations here in San Francisco Bay Area. We have a center called the Regional Center of the East Bay. They can provide lists of resources, programs, and organizations that can provide support, which is how I was able to assist my daughter when I had her assessed for autism, which she didn't have. I was aware of this organization because it was through my job. I worked as an instructional assistant. And so I was just paying attention to the type of services my students were getting, and just making a mental note of the organizations they were working with. And then, just knowing, okay, again, learning the proper terminology. So when I am asking for a service, I know, or just say, I'm not sure if I got this right, but maybe I'm mispronouncing it, but what is this? I've heard about this. Sometimes when you go in to a professional, a little informed, they'll see that you're serious about it. And that's part of advocating, right? Um, Doing your research a little bit, talking to other people, and then of course we're overwhelmed. We still have to work. We still have to take care of home, but then also make sure that you empower yourself. At the same time, yes, this can be overwhelming, but now's your chance to say, okay, but I have control in a way of how I can help my child. Maybe I can, by catching it early, maybe now I can get speech therapy or some type of support until they're able to get to school and get that type of support. It's a way. And then also, remember this. Regardless of your background, you can't compare. Every child is different. You can't compare your child to someone else. You have to you have to look at your own child's progress as their own, just like we all do individually. I can't compare myself to Chioma. I can't compare myself to you, but we all accomplished, we're educated, but we all have our own successes. And that's what it is, look at look at the goals that your own child is meeting just for themselves. Don't compare them to someone else. And then from there, you're able to see what your child is able to do, and try different things, be open, because that's how what your child can and can't do. So, again, it can be overwhelming, but now it's like, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to take this, I'm going to do my little research. When it's my quiet time, write down some numbers. Hey, I've done it where I will be on my lunch break and I'm going to call and make an appointment if I can. You do what you have to do to make it work for you and your family.
I'm thinking of the ways that intersectionality works and does strange things. I remember when we were first starting out getting meetings for our son. It's not often that being a man is a deficit, particularly a white man, right? But I found, and I still find, that whenever I'm in a meeting with my wife and educators talking about our son, they never talk to me. They only talk to my wife, who's brilliant, but she's a nurse, right? She's a critical care nurse, so she's brilliant, but like I'm the educator, right? Like, so this is actually my jam. Like, I know about this, but it's funny the ways that these biases play up. I have to always say, like, so I'm actually the one who does the education bit in our family. So it's just funny how these things play out. One of the things that has occurred to me a lot, both in the classrooms I've taught, teachers I've served, and families I am friendly with, is a particular diagnosis which has troubled me for a long time, and that's oppositional defiant disorder. I don't know the specific stats, so I don't know if Black and brown boys are more likely to have given ODD, oppositional divided disorder, or not. It always struck me as an odd one. It always struck me as an odd diagnosis. And in reading a little bit, a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Vanderkolk, an amazing book about trauma in the brain, how in this particular person's opinion, oppositional defiant disorder is not a thing. It's a symptom of trauma. It's a symptom of other things. I'm wondering how this plays out in your thinking as right, defiance from a child's perspective, that doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? One child doing one action can be seen as ambitious or self-advocating, and to another student could be defiant, right? So like that's a very loaded thing. This is just been something that's on my mind. What does this raise for either of you, Joy or Chioma?
Yeah, for me, I mean, I think it brings up, so if we're talking strategically in terms of advocacy and understanding it intersectionally, like again, all disability categories are not equal, right? ODD is not classically a disability category under IDEA, but we know that through study that again, there are these stigmatizing disability categories that come without the most sound ways of evaluating or assessing for a condition. So the art and science of effective education advocacy for special education is in being able to raise the proper questions. If you see if your child has an emotional disturbance, which ODD would probably fall under, because there is no category called ODD. What they would do is like the child has some kind of mental health condition that is disruptive and is producing problem behavior. So, and we know that this is a disempowered family, and we know that we can't put ADHD without a medical diagnosis. So what we're going to do is we're going to call the kid ED. We don't care. We don't know. We don't want to know. We may be able to get away with having an IEP meeting without the parent and without parental consent. If the family is overwhelmed or the family, some states, a state could say that they tried to get in touch with the parent a couple of times and they couldn't, so they can go ahead and, and move on with the IEP process without parental consent. So it really depends on what is at play. I haven't heard specifically about OD, but we know through study that emotional disturbance is a umbrella category for that, and it's typically used as a weapon, not necessarily to identify kids with legitimate psychiatric conditions, and that's real too. There are kids with psychiatric conditions, right? So ED, which is what that umbrella, mental health, period. These are labeling. So a family can say, you can disagree. You have the right to disagree with a category. You have a right to disagree with an assessment. If you're empowered, you have a right to not accept their services. They have a right to say that there is educational neglect against you. So I don't even want to just get into if a category is real or not. I mean, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not in a medical space. I don't know a DSM category for ODD, and I'm sure there must be something in the DSM for that. What I'm saying, though, is that no matter what the category that you get, whether you fit into any classic discriminated population, if you feel that the diagnosis is incorrect, that your kid's category is incorrectly stated, you have a right to contest it, to ask for an independent educational evaluation, to ask for more information as an analysis of existing data, to ask for a change in disability category, to recategorize. All of these things are within your right. So the trick is knowing what you can do about whatever thing you're facing that doesn't make sense to you. If ODD doesn't make sense to you and your kid, then you have the right to do something about it. the challenge becomes when a parent is not properly empowered in that position to actually take the right steps for up or down on the question. It's not my place to judge.
Joy, any thoughts on any of that stuff?
She almost said it all. She hit it. She hit it. You know, but you just remember, it's your right to always challenge an opinion, especially if you're not aware or familiar with it. It's your right to get a second opinion. It's your right to do whatever you have to make sure, because what if it's a misdiagnosis? That's time and energy wasted that could have been supporting that child and if they were properly diagnosed.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I feel like everything is in the wake of what happened in the Capitol the other day. And even though we're talking about special needs and intersectionality, the thread, at least to me, that keeps coming through, and this is just my belief, so I'll put this out there, is that every structure in America is defined by white supremacy. Right? Every structure it has that piece in it because that's what our nation is. And while I don't usually have any time for white fragility, I'll just name that, like, this does not imply that whoever you are sitting at are a bad person. It just implies that you live in this country and that this country has a history, and it has a history that we perpetuate whether we want to or not. I hopefully am not a bad person, but in the choices I make, I perpetuate systems unwittingly all day, every day, even though I try to fight against it. When we think about serving our students or serving our children, serving our families, what do you see systemic-wide as a key problem to dismantle, to serve families across the intersectionality spectrum? When I work with my students, I ask them to first think about what justice would look like, and then think about how do we get there. So, like, what would justice look like, and how do we get there?
That is a big bite.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
I the risk of sounding like a broken record. I believe heavily in political education, right? Like, so I think it starts just like the steps are going to look different to address a special education issue. The same, similarly, it happens with racial equity. I mean, with less agency, by the way. There are not enough laws on the books with teeth that allow one, especially within an educational environment, to take on, a variety of discriminatory acts that may occur, right? Like, if you can't neatly prove your case, right? Like, that's the limitation of the legal apparatus. You have to be able to prove it. You're not always able to prove the impact of how devastating and destabilizing white supremacy and white supremacist policies and practices can be, right? Like, the more that we create educational spaces, and I don't just say that arbitrarily, where we're sitting down in paralysis analysis, thinking about all that's gone down in history. I'm also thinking about it from the context of what's happening in places like Washington, D.C., which I'm very proud to now be a part of, which is we passed a local law called the REACH Act that now requires every policy, every legislation that happens in the district to be viewed through using a racial equity tool. It's a very small step, and every state should be trying to pass this law if it doesn't exist in your state already, or in your city even, because there are ultra local laws that can support that. And I think that ableism has had some traction, or addressing ableism through legislation has had a lot more traction than racism or even sexism or classism. Like those things don't get as much. Ableism has been, we have the Americans with Disability Act, we have the, Individuals with Disability Education Act, we have the Olmstead ruling, we have just plethora of case law that has supported, this movement because it impacts white people, right? Because it also impacts white people. The question is, even within the disability space, we're not nuanced enough. We're not thinking about disability justice, right? We're still thinking about rights. And if you don't have a justice analysis to disabilities, then that's because your child is probably not set up for the school to prison pipeline, right? Like that means that your child may be able to get employment, that your only worry is what kind of job, not if job. That you're not worried about if you can afford to pay for your child as an adult once they age out of the school system. So if we're dealing with like these racial equity tools and applying these other intersectional things, whether it's immigration or ability, I think we come further along. I'm going to be quiet. I get winded, but that's
beautiful. I love it. Joy, what you got for us?
She hit it perfectly. Because I don't want to go and we'd have running out of time. But no, Chioma hit it. She hit it. But she's right. If you really think about it, you have ADA, you have all these federal protection for people with disabilities, but we still don't have any, in a sense, federal protection for people of color. Or although we do have, is it Title IX or whatever, we have something to protect gender, but we don't have anything protecting race. We still having a hard time trying to get the anti-lynching bill passed. Like what? We still on that, but that goes to show you, certain things are going to pushing forward, but as long as it supports the person, a white person, yeah, it's going to be passed a lot faster than for a person of color.
Right. One thing I just dropped in there, and this is for teachers and families, but it's a way I have learned that it is very common for privileged people like myself to do the work in other communities, right, without doing the work in our own communities. And one of the ways I think that's really powerful is that we might look towards the injustice that we see outwardly, but not address the injustices right here at home. I think one way is that all teachers and families can look at what's going on in their community. It's with the civil rights data collection. I just dropped it in the comments. It was shared there. It's a way to look at all these amounts of data by specific district and specific school. And one of the things I'm working on in my local area, even though we live in a so-called progressive space, right, in southern New Jersey, a very blue state, our schools here are just as likely, if not more likely than others, to be disproportionately disciplining students with disabilities, Black and brown students. This data can help teachers in any school, in any system, families, parents, to say like, okay, let's talk about our school. Let's talk about our district here, and let's solve this problem in this area rather than like that place over there, that place over there, which I think can help kind of create the activism locally. Joy, Chioma, as ever, thank you so much. We are going to be back here on January 25th for our next episode on serving students, serving families with special needs. Until that time, thank you all so much. Joy, Chioma, always such a pleasure. And hopefully one day we will actually see each other in person. Wouldn't that be lovely? Until then, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.